The first time Jacob Lawson heard footsteps on the dirt road outside his fence, he did not look up, because looking up had become a habit he had long since abandoned, and the world beyond his porch railing had become something that belonged to other people. It was the summer of 1883 in the small town of Caldwell, Kansas, a place that sat right on the edge of the Kishom Trail, where the dust never quite settled and the wind always carried the smell of cattle and dry earth. Caldwell was not a large town, but it was a living one, full of drovers passing through and merchants who had decided to plant roots and farmers who scratched at the hard-packed soil and hoped for something better. The town had a main street with a general store, a blacksmith, a saloon that called itself the Silver Creek, a church whose white paint was perpetually peeling, and a small office where the county sheriff kept his badge polished and his temper frayed. Jacob Lawson's house sat at the northern end of town, a little apart from everything else, a weathered two-story structure with a wide front porch that he had built himself in younger years with his own hands. The porch had once been a place of pride. He had sat there with his wife Clara in the evenings and watched the sun go down behind the flat horizon, and they had talked about things like what they would name their children and whether the well needed relining. That had been before the fire. Before the accident at the McKinney Ranch 3 years ago that had left him with a right arm and shoulder so badly scarred that the skin looked like crumpled parchment, and a left leg that walked with a limp so pronounced that the whole town could hear him coming by the rhythm of his uneven step. Clara had left the year after the accident. She had not left in a mean way. She had not screamed or thrown dishes. She had simply packed a bag one October morning, kissed him on the forehead in a way that felt more like a goodbye to a dying man than to a husband, and said that she was going to stay with her sister in Wichita for a while. The while had stretched into forever, and Jacob had received exactly one letter from her, 6 months later, in which she told him she had met someone in Wichita and was seeking a divorce through the county courts. He had signed the papers when the lawyer rode out with them, and he had folded them neatly, and he had gone back to his porch, and he had not left it except to sleep and to eat the meals that his neighbor misses. Dorcas Pemberton occasionally left on his steps out of Christian duty. 3 years. That was how long Jacob Lawson had lived on his porch in the way that some men lived in whiskey, which was to say he had made the porch his entire world, his refuge and his prison at the same time. He kept a rifle across his lap sometimes, not because he expected trouble, but because it was something to hold. He kept a whittling knife too, and he had carved more animals from scraps of wood than he could count, little horses and deer and jackrabbits that lined the porch railing and stared out at the road with blank wooden eyes. He wore his shirts long-sleeved even in the Kansas heat, buttoned at the wrist because he did not want anyone to see what was underneath. He wore his hat low. He did not go to church. He did not go to the Silver Creek Saloon. He did not go to the general store. He did not go anywhere at all. The children of Caldwell had taken to calling him the ghost of the North Road, which was not kind but was the sort of name children give to things they fear and cannot understand. Grown adults in town talked about him, the way people talk about a wound that has never properly healed, with a mixture of pity and discomfort, and the faint guilty relief that it had not happened to them. Sheriff Tom Haverfield had ridden out twice in the first year to check on him, and each time Jacob had told him he was fine with such absolute flatness that even Tom, who was not a particularly perceptive man, understood that the conversation was over. Jacob was 32 years old in the summer of 1883, which was not old by any reasonable measure, but he felt ancient in the way that men feel ancient when they have decided they are done with the future. He was sitting in his usual chair on that particular Tuesday morning in June when the footsteps came. They were different from the footsteps he usually ignored. The usual footsteps on the road were heavy, male, purposeful, the stride of drovers or merchants with somewhere to be. These footsteps were lighter but not delicate. They had a rhythm to them that was efficient rather than leisurely, the kind of walk that belonged to someone who had a destination and intended to reach it without wasting a single step. Jacob did not look up from the piece of pine he was whittling into the shape of a horse. He kept his eyes down and his knife moving and listened to the footsteps approach and then, most unexpectedly, slow, and then stop. He waited for the usual thing, which was a voice asking for directions to the main street, because he was close enough to the road that passing travelers sometimes mistook his porch for a place of welcome. No voice came. He waited for the footsteps to resume. They did not immediately, and the silence was strange enough that he finally lifted his eyes just enough to see below the brim of his hat. A woman stood at his fence gate. She was looking not at him, but at one of the carved wooden animals he had left sitting on the fence post by the gate, a small carved doe with her head turned to one side. The woman was studying it with the focused attention of a person examining something genuinely interesting, turning her head slightly, reaching out with one finger, and touching the doe's carved ear with a kind of unconscious curiosity. She was, Jacob guessed, somewhere around 28 or 29, with dark auburn hair pinned up beneath a practical sunbonnet that she wore tilted back, so that it served more as a neck shade than a proper bonnet. Her dress was a plain blue cotton affair, well made but not new, and she carried a basket over one arm that had a folded cloth on top of what looked like jars. Her face, what he could see of it, was angular and honest, not a fashionable face but a good one, with wide-set green eyes and a mouth set in an expression of thoughtful concentration. She had not looked at him, not once. Her entire attention was on the carved doe, and there was something in the quality of that attention, its completeness, its lack of any sideways glance toward him, that struck him as remarkable. Every person who came near his property since the accident had looked at him. Some stared openly. Some cut their eyes away immediately as though they had seen something indecent. Some managed a painfully neutral expression that was somehow worse than both. But this woman stood 3 feet from his porch and had not so much as registered his existence. "That is very well done," she said, still looking at the doe. Her voice was clear and direct. She spoke the way someone speaks when they say exactly what they mean and nothing more. The ear particularly. Most people who carve animals do not think about the ears. Jacob found, to his considerable surprise, that he was at an entire loss for words. He had not spoken to a woman, except for old Mrs. Pemberton, who he regarded more as weather than a person, in the better part of 2 years. "The ears are what make something look like it is listening," he said finally. His voice came out rustier than he expected, like a hinge that had not been opened in too long. The woman looked up at him then, directly and without the slightest hesitation, with those green eyes that turned out to be quite striking up close. She looked at his face without flinching, without the small involuntary recoil that most people could not fully suppress. Then she looked at his arm where the sleeve was rolled up slightly from the whittling, and he had a sudden impulse to pull it down, but before he could she looked back at the doe. "I agree," she said simply. "Are you Jacob Lawson?" "I am," he said, and he felt the strangeness of using his own name as though he had half forgotten it. "I am Henrietta Fletcher," she said. "I have taken the teaching position at the Caldwell schoolhouse. I am renting the Harmon place on the east side of town. Mrs. Pemberton told me to come speak with you." "About what?" Jacob said. "About whether you would be willing to sell any of your carvings," she said. "The school has almost no decoration. The children need things to look at that are not a blank wall and a chalkboard. Mrs. Pemberton said you make them by the dozens and have nowhere to put them." Jacob looked at the rows of carved animals along his porch railing. He looked at the windowsill inside, visible through the screen, where more animals crowded each other for space. He had, in fact, approximately 67 carved animals and had been wondering, in the vague way he wondered things, what in the world he was going to do with all of them. "I had not thought of selling them," he said. "I would not pay much," Henrietta said, with the frank straightforwardness of someone who has learned to be honest about money because dishonesty about money only makes problems worse. I have $20 set aside for the school from my own wage, which is itself not generous, but I would give what I can. How many do you want? Jacob said. She looked at the rows of animals and counted with her eyes in a businesslike way. 12 would be very good, she said. 15 would be wonderful. Take them, Jacob said. No charge. Henrietta Fletcher looked at him then with an expression that was not pity and not gratitude exactly, but something between the two, a kind of recognition, as though she understood that the offer was about more than carved animals. She did not make a fuss about it. She did not say he was too generous or that she could not possibly accept. She simply nodded and said, "Thank you. That is very kind." She opened the gate without asking and walked up the short path to the porch steps. Jacob watched her come up the steps and stand at the porch railing, looking at each carving in turn with that same focused attention she had given the dough. She chose her 15 with care, holding each one and turning it over, occasionally asking what animal it was meant to be if she was uncertain, and he answered, and the conversation was the most natural conversation he had had in 3 years, which was to say it was almost entirely about the carvings and almost entirely practical, and neither of them said anything particularly significant. And yet Jacob found that, when she had wrapped the 15 animals carefully in her cloth and settled them in her basket and said good day and walked back down the road without looking back, his chest felt strange, as though something that had been pressed flat inside him had very slightly expanded. He sat with that feeling for a long time that evening, watching the light change on the road, turning his knife over in his hand. Henrietta Fletcher came back the following Monday. She walked the same way she had the first time, efficiently and without self-consciousness, and she stopped at the fence again, and this time she looked up at him directly before touching anything. "Good morning," she said. "I wanted to tell you that the children loved the animals. There was a near fight over the carved bear, which I took as high praise." Jacob found that the corner of his mouth moved in a way it had not moved in quite some time. Which child wanted the bear? "A boy named Clarence Whitfield, who is 9 years old and has strong opinions about bears," Henrietta said, and there was a dry humor in her voice that he noticed and appreciated. "He eventually agreed to share custody of it with a girl named Mabel, who argued that she had seen a real bear once and therefore had seniority on the matter." "That is a reasonable argument," Jacob said. "I thought so too," Henrietta said. She looked at the new carvings he had set along the railing since Monday. He had worked more than usual that week, though he had not examined why too closely. "You have been busy." "Nothing else to do," Jacob said. Henrietta opened the gate again, not quite asking but pausing at it in a way that was almost a question. He said nothing to stop her and she came up to the porch. This time she settled herself on the top step without asking, which should have bothered him, because he had not had anyone sit on his steps in years, and it did not bother him at all. "What do you carve from?" she asked, looking at the new pieces. "The wood, I mean. Where do you get it?" "I have a pile of pine and cottonwood around the back," he said. "I had it brought in. I used to do more practical woodwork, furniture and repair work and such. After the accident I could not manage the heavy work anymore, so I moved to smaller pieces." He had not meant to say that last part. It came out the way things come out when a person has been silent so long that words start to have less gravity, less weight, less care attached to them. Henrietta did not react to the word accident the way he had expected, which was to say she did not react with visible discomfort or the careful avoidance that most people used when any reference to what had happened to him came up. She simply said, "What kind of accident?" And Jacob, who had not told the story to anyone in 3 years because he had decided it was over and done and did not merit retelling, heard himself say, "There was a fire at the McKinney ranch east of town. The hay barn caught. Old McKinney had a horse in there that wouldn't come out on its own. I went in after it." He paused. "The roof came down on the right side. The horse got out. I did not get out quite as cleanly." He said it flatly, without drama, because that was how it had happened, as a simple terrible fact with no villain and no particular lesson, Just a barn and a horse and a roof, and a man who made a decision that cost him considerably. Henrietta was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Did the horse live?" Jacob looked at her. "Yes," he said. "McKinney's old bay, she's still out on his east pasture." "Then it was worth it," Henrietta said. She said it simply, not as a consolation but as a calculation, the way a person states a truth that seems obvious to them. Jacob turned the wood in his hand. "Clara did not see it that way," he said, and then immediately felt that he had said too much. But Henrietta did not press. She looked out at the road and said, "I have heard mention of a former wife. The town talks." "The town does talk," Jacob agreed. "It is one of the things towns do best." "My father always said small towns are like gardens," Henrietta said. "Something is always growing, and at least half of it is weeds." She stood up from the step, brushing her skirt in a matter-of-fact way. "I should get back. I have lesson plans to write for the week." She picked up her basket. "I did not come to choose more animals today. I only came to tell you about Clarence and the bear. But if you have any you would be willing to part with, I could use 2 or 3 more. Some of the children who have been absent are feeling left out." "Take what you like," Jacob said. She chose 3 from the railing, a rabbit, a hawk, and what he had intended as a bull but which had turned out looking more like a very confident cow. She wrapped them in her cloth. She started down the steps and then paused, one hand on the railing. "I will come back on Friday if that is agreeable," she said. "Not for more animals necessarily, just to sit on your steps if you do not mind. I find this end of town pleasantly quiet." Jacob looked at her back, at the practical set of her shoulders, at the way she held the basket without strain. "Friday is agreeable," he said. She nodded once and walked away down the road in the same efficient stride that he was already recognizing as distinctly hers, and Jacob sat with his carving knife and felt that expanded feeling in his chest again, wider this time. Henrietta came on Friday, as she had said she would. She brought her own chair that time, a small folding wooden chair that she must have borrowed from the schoolhouse, which made Jacob laugh out loud, a short rusty sound that startled them both. She had brought a book too, and she sat on the step below the porch and read while he carved, and they spoke occasionally about small things, the weather, a mention in the Caldwell newspaper about the railroad expansion. Whether the Silver Creek actually had silver in it, it did not. Henrietta had asked 3 different people and received 3 equally uninformed answers. It was companionable in a way that Jacob had entirely forgotten that time spent with another person could be. He noticed, over the course of that Friday afternoon, that Henrietta Fletcher had a way of being present that most people did not have. She was not performing for him. She was not trying to fix him or cheer him or coax him out of himself in the way that well-meaning people try to coax a cat from under a porch. She was simply there, existing at the edge of his space, and she had about her a quality of contained self-sufficiency that he found deeply restful. She was also, he was beginning to understand, someone who had her own history. He did not ask about it that Friday. He asked about it the following week, on a Tuesday when she came by on her way home from school and stopped at the gate and called up to ask if he had any extra pine scraps she could have because 2 of the children in her class wanted to try carving their own animals. He brought the scraps from the back of the house, carrying them in a crate, and she took the crate from him at the bottom of the porch steps, and as she was settling the crate under her arm she said, "You walk down the steps." Jacob looked down at the steps as though surprised by this information. He had in fact walked down the steps without really thinking about it, the first time he had descended to the yard in quite some time. "So I did," he said. There was a pause that was not uncomfortable. Henrietta said, "I am from Missouri originally, Jefferson City." She said it the way people say things they are deciding to share, not volunteering it as an offering but stating it as a fact in the spirit of exchange. "I had a husband there. His name was Thomas Fletcher. He died of typhoid in the winter of 1881. "I am sorry," Jacob said. "I am also," she said. "He was a good man. Not a brilliant man, Not a romantic man in the storytelling sense, but a good man, which I have come to understand is quite rare. She looked at the crate under her arm. After he died, I found I did not want to stay in Jefferson City. Too many things were too familiar, and the familiar things hurt. I applied for teaching positions elsewhere. Caldwell was the one that answered. You chose to come somewhere you knew nobody, Jacob said. I chose to come somewhere the familiar things were not there to hurt me, Henrietta said. It is a different reason, though it looks similar from the outside. Jacob looked at the crate of wood in her arm. He looked at the road beyond his fence, the dust of it, the two wagon wheel tracks in the middle, the dry grass on either side. He looked at the western horizon where the sky was doing extraordinary things with pink and gold. He had not, he realized, actually looked at the horizon in some time. He had been looking at the porch. I understand that reason, he said. Henrietta met his eyes briefly. I thought you might, she said. She shifted the crate. I will have the children bring these back when they are done with them. Good evening, Jacob. She walked away, and he stood at the bottom of his porch steps watching her go. And then he stood there a few minutes longer, listening to the sounds of Caldwell at dusk, the distant call of someone driving cattle down the main street, the creak of a sign in the evening wind, the piano starting up at the Silver Creek 3 blocks away. The world beyond his fence was making itself known to him through sound in a way it had not done in years, and he stood in it and let it happen. He went back up the steps eventually, but he went up slowly, as a man goes up who is in no particular hurry to remove himself from the open air. The summer deepened, and Henrietta's visits acquired a rhythm. She came on Tuesdays and Fridays without fail, and sometimes on Saturday mornings, and occasionally on an unscheduled Wednesday when she had something to tell him that could not wait until Friday, such as the information that Clarence Whitfield had successfully carved a passable bear of his own, and had presented it to Mabel with some ceremony, a development that both Henrietta and Jacob agreed was highly satisfactory. The porch became their shared space in an incremental and unspoken way. Henrietta brought her folding chair, and Jacob found himself setting an extra glass of water out on the railing because it was a hot summer, and she always had to ask for water, and it seemed simple enough to just have it ready. Henrietta brought dried apricots one Tuesday and left half of them on the railing without comment, and he ate them after she left and thought they were very good. She brought a local newspaper one Friday, and they argued companionably about an editorial regarding the cattle trade, Henrietta holding that the editorial was short-sighted, and Jacob holding that it was merely poorly written but not necessarily wrong. And the argument lasted the better part of 2 hours, and ended without resolution, which was one of the most satisfying conversations Jacob had had in years. He noticed things about her that he had not expected to notice. He noticed that she laughed quietly, almost to herself, with her mouth turning up on one side first and then the other, like a thing she was deciding about. He noticed that she was left-handed, and that she held her pen with a slight awkward angle that she had clearly never corrected. He noticed that she had opinions about nearly everything, and expressed them with a directness that occasionally surprised the hell out of him, such as the afternoon she observed, regarding the nearby saloon, that the Silver Creek's prices were robbery, and the owner, Mr. Dugas, was aware of this, and considered it a point of pride. He noticed that she looked at his scars, not the way other people looked at them, which was either in fascinated horror or in the deliberate avoidance that was its own kind of horror. Henrietta looked at his scars the way she looked at the carved animals, with focused, honest attention, as though they were simply a part of the thing she was observing, and she saw no reason to pretend otherwise. Once, on a very warm August Friday when he had his right sleeve rolled up without thinking about it, she looked at the scars on his forearm and said, "Does it still hurt?" "Mostly in cold weather," he said. "The skin pulls." "I imagine," she said, and looked away, and that was the entire conversation about it. And it was somehow the conversation that healed more of the wound than anything else that had happened in 3 years. He began in late July to come down from the porch more regularly. Not far, not initially. He would come down the steps and stand in the yard when she was there, or walk the length of the fence looking at the garden he had let go wild that he was beginning to feel guilty about. She did not remark on this except once, when she said, in a tone that was careful to be casual, "Your mint has taken over completely. It does that if you let it." "I know," he said. "I planted it to keep the rabbits off the vegetables." "Did it work?" "Brilliantly," he said, "so brilliantly that it then ate the vegetables itself." Henrietta smiled at that, the full two-stage smile, and Jacob felt something loosen in his chest that had been drawn tight so long he had forgotten what loose felt like. In August, something happened that was not strictly part of the story of Jacob Lawson's Porch, but which became part of the story of Jacob Lawson and Henrietta Fletcher, which is the story that matters. There was a man in Caldwell named Rupert Graves who ran a small livestock operation on the south side of town, and who had an interest in Henrietta that was not returned, and that he did not handle with any particular grace. He was not a dangerous man in the manner of the outlaws that sometimes pass through Caldwell on the Kisham Trail circuit, not a man with a history of violence or a reputation that would have caused Sheriff Haverfield to pay attention. He was simply the kind of man who believed that a widow of 28 ought to be grateful for attention from a man with property, and that a woman who did not demonstrate this gratitude was being unreasonable. He had been coming to the schoolhouse on Fridays after the children left, ostensibly with questions about whether his nephew, who had recently moved to town, might attend the school. The nephew questions had run out by the second visit, and the visits had continued regardless, and Henrietta had told Jacob about them with a flat matter-of-factness that did not quite disguise the edge of annoyance underneath. "Has he behaved badly?" Jacob asked. He had come down the steps that day and was sitting on the second step, which was as far down as he had been all summer, and he had his forearms on his knees and his hat tilted back. "Not in any specific way," Henrietta said. "He is not threatening. He is just very certain that he is doing me a favor by appearing, and I find that quality tiresome. Has he been told he is not welcome?" "I have told him twice," she said. "He interprets everything as an invitation to explain himself more fully, which is its own kind of conversation I cannot seem to end." Jacob turned his knife in his hand. "Do you want me to speak to him?" Henrietta looked at him with an expression that was thoughtful rather than dismissive. "I do not believe that will be necessary," she said, "but I appreciate the offer genuinely." The following Friday, Rupert Graves came to the schoolhouse and found Henrietta already walking up the north road with Jacob Lawson beside her. Jacob had not planned it exactly. He had simply found himself, that Friday morning, putting on a clean shirt for the first time in quite a while, and when he heard the clock inside the house showing 3 in the afternoon, which was when the school let out, he had found himself standing on his front path rather than on his porch. He had walked to the schoolhouse. The distance from his house to the schoolhouse was 4 blocks, which was not a great distance by any measure, but it was the farthest Jacob Lawson had walked in 3 years, and he had felt every one of those 4 blocks in his left leg, and in the tightness of being in the open street with people who could see him. 2 people had stared. One woman from the church, Mrs. Adeline Corker, had actually stopped and then started again as though she had seen an apparition that resolved into a man. He had kept his hat low and his pace steady. He had been standing outside the schoolhouse door when Henrietta came out with her basket and papers under her arm, and she had stopped and looked at him with the same directness she gave everything, and she had said, "Jacob, you came to town." "I did," he said. "I thought I might walk you home." Henrietta had looked at him for a moment, and in that moment he had the clear and unambiguous sense that she understood exactly what it had cost him to walk those 4 blocks, and that she was not going to make a production of it in either direction. She had simply said, "I would appreciate the company," and they had walked together up the main street and then up the north road, and Rupert Graves had come around the corner of the schoolhouse just in time to see them going, and he had stood looking after them, and he had not appeared at the schoolhouse on the following Friday. That walk was, without either of them saying so, a turning point. Jacob began coming into town once or twice a week. Not far, not for long, not with any great fanfare. He went to the general store for the first time since the accident, and Mr. Horace Webb behind the counter, to his considerable credit, said simply, "Morning, Lawson. What do you need?" without any particular ceremony, which Jacob appreciated enormously. He walked with Henrietta when she needed to carry things that were heavy, because he still had one perfectly functional arm and a strong back, and there was no reason for her to carry heavy things alone if he was available to help. He walked her home from school on Fridays. He met her at the general store sometimes and helped carry her supplies for the schoolhouse. These were practical arrangements, and he told himself they were practical arrangements, and they were in part, but they were also something else, and he knew it and she knew it, and neither of them said so yet. The children at the school knew about it, of course, because children are keenly observant about matters of the heart. Clarence Whitfield, who had become something of a character in the ongoing account of Henrietta's life that Jacob was constructing, apparently told his mother that Miss Fletcher had a friend, and then described Jacob Lawson in enough detail that Clarence's mother, Patricia Whitfield, understood exactly who was meant and found occasion to mention it to 3 or 4 people over the following week. The town, which had been watching Jacob Lawson's porch for 3 years with the collective guilt of people who have watched someone suffering and done nothing particularly useful about it, found itself in the mixed position of being pleased and curious and invested in a situation that was none of its business. The general consensus at the Silver Creek, Jacob heard through the various channels by which news travels in a small town, was that it was about time. He was not sure what it was time for exactly, but he understood the sentiment. It came to a head on a Wednesday in September, which was not a Tuesday or a Friday, and therefore not an established visiting day, when Henrietta came to his house in the early evening looking flushed and carrying a letter in her hand. She did not stop at the gate. She opened it and came straight up to the porch, which she had not done unbidden before, and sat down in her chair, which she had taken to leaving on the porch between visits, and pressed the letter flat on her knee with her palm. "I have received a letter from my brother Daniel," she said. "In Jefferson City." Jacob waited. "He is ill," she said. "His wife has written on his behalf. He has been ill since spring, and it has not improved. She wants me to come back to Jefferson City." The evening light was doing the same extraordinary thing with the horizon that it had been doing all September, turning the sky colors that seemed excessive, as though the sky was trying too hard to be beautiful and not quite succeeding at subtlety. Jacob looked at Henrietta's face, which was pale and set in the way faces get when people are holding something difficult at a careful distance while they decide what to do with it. "Is he your only brother?" Jacob said. "Yes," she said. "There are 3 of us, Daniel and myself and our sister Margaret, who is in St. Louis. I am the one without roots at present. Margaret has 4 children and a husband who farms." She looked down at the letter. "I do not want to go back to Jefferson City." "Because of Thomas," Jacob said. Henrietta looked up at him. "In part," she said, "and in part because of other things that are here." There was a silence then that was entirely different from their usual silences, which were comfortable and easy. This silence had weight and direction. "Henrietta," Jacob said, and stopped. She waited. She was very good at waiting. "I am aware," Jacob said slowly, the way a man speaks when he is being very careful about something that matters, that I am not what a woman would reasonably choose. I have been sitting on this porch for 3 years, and before that I was ordinary enough but nothing exceptional, and I have got a leg that does not work properly and an arm that looks the way it looks, and I am 32 years old, and I have not done much that is worth pointing to in quite some time." Henrietta opened her mouth. "I am not finished," he said, not unkindly. She closed her mouth. "I am saying all of that," he continued, "because I want to be honest before I say the next part, which is that you are the reason I am walking to town again, and you are the reason I got up off that porch, and I do not know entirely what to do with that because it has been a long time since I knew what to do with much of anything. But I know that the idea of you going to Jefferson City is something I do not like, and I know that the reason I do not like it is not practical. It is personal, and I think you should know that." Henrietta Fletcher looked at him for a long moment with those direct green eyes, and then she said, "Jacob Lawson, you are the least broken person I have met since I came to Kansas." He stared at her. "I have not left my porch in 3 years. You had left it before I got here," she said. "You left it a long time ago in the interior sense. You just did not know it yet." She folded the letter carefully. "I am not going to Jefferson City. Your brother is ill." "My brother is ill, and Margaret is closer to Jefferson City than I am, and has managed to forget this fact because it is easier to ask me. I will write to Margaret." She set the folded letter on the railing. "And I am going to stay in Caldwell and teach Clarence Whitfield and Mabel and the others through the winter, and I am going to sit on your porch on Tuesdays and Fridays." "And Saturdays," Jacob said. "And Saturdays," Henrietta agreed. He reached across the space between them, not very far. They were sitting quite close by this point in the way that people sit who have stopped observing careful distance, and he took her hand, which was warm and capable and absolutely steady. He held it. She turned her hand over and held his back. That was how it started, in the way that most real things start, not with a declaration but with a hand held in the September evening on a porch in Caldwell, Kansas, while the sky went extravagant colors behind the flat horizon, and the sound of the Silver Creek's piano drifted up from 3 blocks away. The weeks that followed were the most alive weeks Jacob had experienced since before the accident, and he was only beginning to understand how numb he had been by noticing the contrast with how he felt now, which was the way a man feels when blood returns to a limb that has been asleep. A kind of painful, lovely, tingling aliveness that was simultaneously welcome and almost too much to hold. He went to town more often. He went to the general store with regularity now and had re-established credit with Horace Webb and ordered supplies for proper woodworking, because the idea of doing larger pieces was returning to him with a persistence that suggested it wanted to be acted upon. He went to the church one Sunday, not because he had re-established the kind of faith that sits easily in pews, but because Henrietta sang in the small choir, and he had heard her singing to herself on the porch one Saturday, and the sound of it had made him want to hear it in a larger space. The church occasion was notable for several reasons, not least being that it was the first time the bulk of Caldwell's population had seen Jacob Lawson in public daylight in 3 years. He wore his good shirt, the dark blue one that he had not worn since before Clara left, and he wore his hat at the usual angle, and he walked in with his uneven stride and sat in the 3rd pew from the back, and he watched Reverend Hollis's expression do something complicated and then smooth out into professional welcome. Henrietta saw him from the choir section, and the corner of her mouth went up, the one-sided beginning of her smile, and he felt the smile like a physical thing, warm and specific. After the service, outside in the dusty churchyard, people spoke to him. This was not as terrible as he had expected, in part because most people had the good grace to treat his 3-year absence as a matter of no particular note, or perhaps they had simply missed him enough to be glad he was there without feeling the need to examine it. Patricia Whitfield told him her son Clarence talked about him constantly, which was both touching and slightly alarming. Sheriff Tom Haverfield shook his hand and said simply, "Good to see you out, Jacob," with genuine warmth and not a syllable of commentary. Horace Webb said something about the woodworking supplies that turned into a conversation about whether Jacob might take on some repair work for the store, which he said he would think about. He thought about it and said yes the following Monday, which surprised Horace and did not surprise Henrietta at all. The repair work was small at first, a set of cabinet doors at the general store, a broken table at the church hall. Jacob discovered that the larger work, The work that needed two good hands rather than one good hand and one that could grip but not turn precisely, required a different approach than he had used before the accident. He worked out the approach over several evenings, adapting his methods, using clamps where he used to use the second hand, developing a patience with wood that he had not needed before because before he had simply been fast. The work was slower now. It was also, in some way he could not entirely articulate better. He made Henrietta a bookshelf. He had not announced this project. He had simply made it, working in the shed behind the house over the course of 3 weeks in October, and when it was finished, it was a good piece of work. Solid walnut with a small carved detail on the top rail, a line of running deer that he had whittled into the edge with his smaller knife. It was not the fastest shelf he had ever made. Every joint was fitted with an exactness that came from the extra time the work required now, and he looked at it when it was finished and felt a satisfaction that was clean and complete. He brought it to the Harmon place on a Saturday morning in his wagon, which was the first time he had taken the wagon out since the accident, and Henrietta opened the door and looked at the shelf and looked at him and said, "Jacob, you made this." "You have too many books on the floor," he said. It seemed obvious. She ran her hand along the carved deer on the top rail, the same way she had touched the doe on his fence post on the very first day, and he watched her do it and felt the particular pleasure of having made something for a specific person and watching that person understand it. "It is beautiful," she said. And then, quietly, "You are beautiful." He stood in her doorway with one hand on the shelf and felt the words land somewhere deep inside him, in a place that had been dark for a long time, and the dark was considerably less dark now. He brought the shelf inside and set it up against the east wall of her sitting room, and they arranged her books on it together, which turned into an argument about whether books ought to be arranged by subject or by author's name that was purely enjoyable, and resulted in a compromise arrangement that satisfied neither of them entirely and pleased them both very much. He kissed her that afternoon, standing in her sitting room with a copy of a farming almanac in one hand and a book of American poetry in the other, in the middle of the ongoing argument about organization. It happened the way such things happen when two people have been circling something for long enough that the circling becomes indistinguishable from the thing itself, and suddenly they are simply there, close together, and the space between them closes. He kissed her and she kissed him back, and the almanac and the poetry fell on the floor, and they stood in the afternoon light of the Harmon Place's sitting room and were very still together for a moment. "I should tell you," Jacob said, when they had drawn back slightly and were looking at each other at close range, "that I am not going to be a simple man to be with. My leg is what it is and my arm is what it is, and I have spent 3 years talking to nobody, and I have some things still to sort out in myself." "I know," Henrietta said. She picked up the almanac from the floor and the poetry book. She put them on the new shelf, almanac first, poetry after, both defying the organizational system they had just agreed upon, which was the kind of statement that said rather a lot about her feelings on the matter. "I am not a simple woman either. I have a dead husband I still think about sometimes, and a stubbornness that has been characterized as aggressive by multiple people whose opinions I do not entirely value, and I have very strong feelings about how things ought to be organized which I am clearly willing to override when the occasion calls for it." Jacob looked at the shelf where the almanac sat next to the poetry. "That was the occasion calling for it," he said. "Do not read too much into it," Henrietta said, and her full smile was there, both sides, and he thought it was the best thing in the entire state of Kansas. November came to the plains of Kansas with the particular finality that November brings to flat country, the sky going steel gray and the wind coming down from the north, with nothing between it and the town, except about 200 miles of open grassland. The dust of summer was gone, replaced by the particular smell of cold air and dry grass that is the smell of the Kansas winter making itself known. Jacob fixed the front windows of his house, which had needed new glazing for 2 years, and he brought in wood for the winter, and he fixed the fence gate which had been listing to the left since a windstorm the previous spring, and he fixed other things around the house that had been needing attention since the accident, working at his new pace, which was slower and more careful and produced things that were sturdier than the speed of before. The town, which had been watching the developments with considerable interest, arrived at a general position of cautious approval regarding Jacob and Henrietta. Not everyone in Caldwell was entirely at ease with every aspect of the situation, because small towns in 1883 had opinions about the proper pace of things between a widow and a divorced man. But the opinions were mostly expressed among themselves rather than directly at either party, and the directly expressed opinions were generally civil. There was one exception, which was a woman named Beatrice Harlow, whose late husband had been a close friend of Jacob's before the accident, and who had taken it upon herself to call on Henrietta one afternoon in October with a basket of preserves and a series of observations dressed up as concerned advice. Henrietta had told Jacob about this visit without particular heat, describing Beatrice's suggestions that Jacob was not the kind of man a young widow ought to invest herself in, and her assessment that Henrietta was perhaps not fully aware of what she was taking on. "What did you say?" Jacob asked. He was, he noticed, not particularly troubled by this story, which would once have sent him straight into the dark corner of himself, where he kept all the evidence that he was indeed not worth investing in. "I said thank you for the preserves," Henrietta said, "and that I was fully capable of assessing what I was taking on and had done so with considerable care, and that Jacob Lawson was the most honest, capable, and fundamentally decent person in this town, including herself, and that she was welcome to take the preserves back if she disagreed." Jacob was quiet for a moment. "Did she take the preserves back?" "She did not," Henrietta said. "The preserves are very good, actually. Peach. Would you like some?" He would, and he ate them, and he felt something resolve in him that he had been carrying since before the accident, a kind of low-level certainty that the world's opinion of him was correct, that he had been weighed and found wanting, and that the evidence was the fire and the scars and the empty house and the 3 years on the porch. The certainty was quieter now. It had not entirely gone, because 3 years of silence leaves marks that are slower to heal than scars, but it was quieter, and Henrietta's voice was louder, and the balance was shifting. He asked her to marry him on a Sunday in December, the Sunday before Christmas. He had thought about how to do this for approximately 6 weeks, and he had arrived at the conclusion that there was no arrangement of words or circumstances that would make the asking anything other than what it was, which was one person asking another to be their permanent companion in the particular, specific, and official way that the law and the church and the general consensus of 1883 Kansas made possible. He did not want theater. He did not want to manufacture a moment that was more for the story than for the two of them. He asked her on the porch. It was early evening, and they had had supper together in his kitchen, which had become a regular occurrence over the past weeks, and she had made a beef stew that was better than anything he had made himself in years, because she cooked with the same directness she brought to everything else. They had come out to the porch as they usually did after supper, sitting in their respective chairs, watching the last light go out of the sky to the west. "Henrietta," he said. "Jacob," she said, in the same tone, which meant she had heard something in his voice. He looked at her, not with his hat down but with his face fully toward her in the December dusk. "I would like to marry you," he said. "I know I am not what anyone would call an easy prospect, and I know we have been acquainted a relatively short time in the formal sense, though it feels longer, and I know you have made one life already and lost it, and I am asking you to make another one, which is a considerable thing to ask. But I would like to marry you if you would be willing." Henrietta looked at him for a moment in the quiet December air, and then she said, "Jacob, I have been waiting for you to ask that question for approximately 2 months. 2 months, he said. "Since October," she said. I had decided that if you did not ask by Christmas, I was going to ask you myself, which I understand is unorthodox, but which I believe you would not have objected to." "I would not have objected," he said. "I know," she said. "Yes, I will marry you." He took her hand across the railing between their chairs, the same way he had taken it on the September evening when it started, and the sky was completely dark now over Caldwell, Kansas, and the Silver Creek's piano was playing something slow, and the wind was coming from the north with the smell of coming snow, and Jacob Lawson was sitting on his porch holding Henrietta Fletcher's hand, and the porch did not feel like a prison at all anymore. It felt like the place where his life was happening. They were married in late February of 1884, on a Saturday when the weather had gone unseasonably mild, and there was even a kind of pale sun over the plains, which Reverend Hollis took as a sign and Jacob took as simply good luck, which he was beginning to believe in again. The wedding was not large, because neither of them had large families nearby, and because Henrietta's preference for things to be real rather than elaborate made a quiet ceremony more fitting than a production. Sheriff Haverfield and his wife stood as witnesses. Horace Webb and his wife came. Patricia Whitfield brought Clarence, who sat in the front pew of the church and watched the whole thing with the solemn satisfaction of someone who believed they had personally had a hand in bringing it about, which was not entirely wrong. Mrs. Pemberton came and cried in a way that was happy, touching her handkerchief to her eyes throughout the ceremony while smiling broadly, and told everyone afterward that she had known it would happen, which was generous of her given that she had mostly known Jacob as the man she left food on the steps for. Henrietta's sister Margaret came from St. Louis. This was the first time Jacob had met Margaret, and she was like Henrietta in the bone structure and the directness of her gaze, but was warmer in her immediate manner, quicker to show what she felt, and she had shaken Jacob's hand when they were introduced and said, "I have heard a great deal about you, and all of it has been good," and then looked at Henrietta with an expression that said the conversation between the two sisters on the matter had been a long one. Their brother Daniel, Henrietta's ill brother, had improved enough by winter that his wife had written to say he was on the mend, which was a relief that had settled something in Henrietta's posture that Jacob had not realized had been tight until he saw it release. At the ceremony, when Reverend Hollis said the words that the law and the church required, Jacob Lawson stood at the front of the small white-painted church in his good shirt with his hat in his hand, and looked at Henrietta beside him in a blue dress that was not quite the same blue as the dress she had worn the first day, but was close enough that it made him think of it, of the woman who had stopped at his gate and looked at a carved doe without looking at him, without seeing the scars before she saw the person, and had changed the entire direction of his life by the simple act of paying attention to the right things. When Hollis said he might kiss his bride, he kissed her, and there was a small sound of approval from the pews that he was aware of without being embarrassed by, because embarrassment about good things was a luxury he had decided to stop indulging. They walked out of the church into the pale February sun, and Clarence Whitfield, who was standing on the church steps, said, "Mr. Lawson, are you going to stay now?" in the frank way of 9-year-old boys who ask the actual question. Jacob looked at him and then at Henrietta beside him. "Yes," he said, "I am going to stay." Spring came to Caldwell with the particular abundance that follows a hard winter, the grasslands going green in a way that felt extravagant after the gray of January and February, and the sky going that particular wide open blue that is one of the best things about the Kansas plains, and that Jacob had been looking at for years without quite seeing. He moved Henrietta's things from the Harmon place to his house over a weekend in April, and the house, which had been full only of wooden animals and quiet and the particular heavy silence of a man alone for too long, filled up with her books and her folding chair, and 2 quilts she had made in Jefferson City and a cast-iron skillet she was attached to with a devotion that amused him greatly. The bookshelf he had made went against the east wall of the sitting room, and over the following months it filled with books that they acquired separately and together, a mixture that reflected the two of them in the way that shared bookshelves always do. His almanacs and a history of the Kishom Trail, and a book about woodworking. Her collected poetry and a natural history of the plains, and a novel by Thomas Hardy that she had read twice and pressed on him with the firmness of someone who is not taking no for an answer. He read the Hardy novel. He admitted it was good. She was gracious about this. He worked steadily through the spring and into the summer, the furniture and repair work spreading by word of mouth in the way work spreads when it is done well. Until by May, he had a proper list of commissions that kept him busy through the week, and he had hired a boy, young Elias Crane, who was 17 and strongly built and eager to learn, to help him with the heavier lifting that his right arm could not manage alone. Elias was a good worker and learned quickly, and had the quality that Jacob had found most valuable in a young person working with their hands, which was the willingness to be wrong and correct course without treating it as a humiliation. Jacob found himself, to his own mild surprise, enjoying the teaching of it, the passing of knowledge about wood and joint and finish, the particular vocabulary of working with material that has its own grain and preference. Henrietta's school year ended in June, and she had been rehired for the following year, which had not been certain because the school board's finances were precarious in the way that frontier school board finances were always precarious. The certainty of her return was a relief to both of them, and she spent the summer gardening with a controlled ferocity that did wonders for the yard, including an outright victory over the mint that Jacob had predicted was not possible, and that she achieved through sheer determined thinning. She wrote to her brother Daniel in Jefferson City through the spring, and his letters back described a gradual improvement, and by summer he was well enough to write himself in his own handwriting, and Henrietta read these letters to Jacob in the evenings on the porch, and he listened to the stories of Daniel and their childhood in Jefferson City with the kind of interest that only comes from genuinely wanting to know everything about a person. She was, he discovered as the months became a year, full of stories. She was not a talker in the constant way of some people, but she had a rich interior life that she shared in portions, and each portion opened into another story, another piece of herself, another angle of who she was that he had not seen yet. She had grown up in a house with a father who was a lawyer and a mother who taught piano, and who had strong opinions about the proper education of daughters, which had shaped Henrietta into someone who read widely and argued clearly, and had been, her father used to say with a mixture of pride and exhaustion, the best prepared witness he had never had the chance to put on the stand. She had wanted to be a lawyer herself. She told him one evening in early autumn of 1884, when they had been married about 7 months and were sitting on the porch in the last warmth of the year. She said it without bitterness, just as a fact about a door that had been closed before she reached it, because in 1883 Kansas, a woman becoming a lawyer was theoretical rather than practical. "You would have been an excellent lawyer," Jacob said. "I know," Henrietta said, without false modesty, which was one of the things he loved about her, the way she could state a true thing about herself without either inflating it or apologizing for it. "You are an excellent teacher," he said. "I know that too," she said. "The children learn well. Clarence Whitfield got his mathematics right 3 weeks in a row, which I consider a genuine achievement and have told him so." How did Clarence receive this news? He attempted to be modest about it, which was sufficiently uncharacteristic that Mabel laughed, which made him laugh, and the resulting chaos took about 5 minutes to settle. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the stars which were very good over the flat Kansas plains on a clear night, the kind of stars that remind you that the world is enormous. "I like teaching. I liked it more than I expected to when I first came here. These children are going to need good teaching because the world they grow up in is going to ask things of them that we cannot entirely predict." Jacob looked at the stars too. "The railroad is going to change everything," he said. It was a thing people said in those years along the cattle routes because they all knew it was true, that the coming of the railroads deeper into the territory was going to change the nature of the trail drives and the range work and the economy of towns like Caldwell that existed partly on the cattle trade. Yes, Henrietta said. And those children will need to be prepared for a world that thinks differently than we do, and they will need good mathematics and good reading and good clear thinking to navigate it. She looked at him sideways. Mabel particularly. She has a mind like a steel trap and the ambition to match, and if anyone from this school grows up to practice law, it will be her. Not Clarence, Jacob said. Clarence is going to be an excellent rancher, Henrietta said with great certainty. He has an instinctive understanding of animals and absolutely no patience for abstractions, which are exactly the right qualities. Jacob laughed, and the laugh was easy and full, the way his laughs had been becoming over the past year, less like rust and more like something that had been there all along and had found its way back. The following spring, in March of 1885, Henrietta told him she was going to have a child. She told him in the kitchen on a Tuesday morning before she left for school, in the same direct way she told him things, looking at him steadily while she said it, watching his face with a careful attention that told him she was not certain how he would receive the news. He stood in the kitchen holding his coffee cup and let the information settle into him, and what settled with it was not the anxiety he might have expected, the worry about whether he could manage, whether he was enough, whether the broken pieces of him would hold under the weight of new responsibility. What settled was something that felt like completion, like the final piece of a structure finding its place, like a door opening in a room he had not known was there. He set down the coffee cup and crossed the kitchen, which was not very large, and took her face in both his hands, the good left hand and the scarred right hand, and he kissed her forehead, and then he said, "That is the best news I have ever received in my life." Henrietta let out a breath that suggested she had been holding it for some time, and then she put her hands over his and said, "I thought you would be pleased. I also thought I should tell you before I told anyone else, which I have done with considerable restraint, because Mrs. Pemberton asks me pointed questions every time I see her." "Mrs. Pemberton will be beside herself," Jacob said. "She will be insufferable," Henrietta said, with great affection. He walked her to the schoolhouse that morning, both of them in the mild March air, and the walk was the same walk they had made many times now, past the main street where Horace Webb was opening his store, past the church where Reverend Hollies was sweeping the steps, past the sheriff's office where Tom Haverfield raised a hand from the doorway. Jacob walked with his uneven step and his hat at the usual angle, and nobody stared at him anymore because he had been part of the town again long enough that he was simply Jacob Lawson, the woodworker who made good furniture and walked his wife to school on mornings. Summer of 1885 was long and warm in the way of Kansas summers, the heat pressing down on the plains with a thoroughness that left everything golden and slightly stunned. Henrietta's school year ended again in June, and she spent the summer in a modified version of her usual activities, gardening with somewhat less ferocity and reading considerably more, and sitting on the porch in the evenings in the chair that had always been her chair, which had long since stopped being a folding school chair, and was now a proper rocking chair that Jacob had made her in the workshop during the winter. He had carved small running horses on the arms of the rocking chair, which she had noticed immediately, and said nothing about except to run her finger along them in the way that was her highest form of appreciation. He expanded the workshop that summer, adding a proper lumber storage lean-to and a second workbench that Elias used when he was there. The commissions had grown to the point where Jacob had more work than he could manage alone, and Elias had become a genuine skilled assistant rather than just heavy lifting, his young hands quick and certain with the simpler work while Jacob handled the joinery and the detail. It was a good summer, full and purposeful in the way that summers are when life has settled into something that is working. The baby was born on a Monday in October, the 17th, in the early morning before the sun had finished rising, with the practical efficiency of a child who had a mother known for wasting no time on anything. He was a boy. Jacob held him in the kitchen while the doctor, old Dr. Miles Cavanaugh, who had been in Caldwell since before Jacob was born, and who had seen the accident 3 years before, and who now looked at Jacob holding his son with an expression of deep, unguarded gladness, cleaned up and gave his instructions. And Henrietta lay in their bed watching her husband hold their child with the particular tiredness that belongs to women who have just done the hardest possible thing and emerged on the other side. The baby was red and small and had his eyes screwed shut against the light, and Jacob held him with the kind of careful exactness that a man uses when he is holding something that is both very fragile and very important. And he looked down at the small face and felt something that had no adequate word, something that was beyond love in the usual sense, the particular profound specific love that a parent feels in that first moment. "What shall we call him?" Henrietta said from the bed, her voice soft and a little rough. Jacob looked at her over the small head. "I was thinking Daniel," he said, "for your brother." Henrietta was quiet for a moment, and he saw something move across her face that was warm and deep. "Daniel," she said. "Yes, that is exactly right. Daniel Lawson was born on the 17th of October, 1885, in Caldwell, Kansas, and his first sound in the world was a small certain cry that went straight through his father's chest and rearranged everything that was in there. The winter that followed was different from the previous winters. The house was different, full of the sounds of a baby in the way that changes the entire nature of a space, and Jacob and Henrietta managed it with a combination of efficiency and mutual support that reflected who they both were, taking turns with the night wakings, adjusting the rhythm of their days around the new small person who had arrived with strong opinions about when he wanted feeding, and when he wanted holding, and when he wanted to look at things. He was very interested in looking at things, young Daniel, from very early on. He would fix his gaze on something with an attention that was recognizable to Jacob as Henrietta's kind of attention, focused and complete, and he would study it with a seriousness that made the adults around him want to laugh with delight rather than at him. The carved animals became Daniel's introduction to the world of objects. The first time Jacob held the small carved doe, the same one from the fence post that had started everything, up where Daniel could look at it, the baby's eyes had tracked it with an absorption so complete that Henrietta said quietly, "There he is," in the tone of someone recognizing a person they have been waiting to meet. Elias Crane, who had by this point been with Jacob in the workshop for 2 years and was 19, and had the beginning of something like real mastery in his hands, became a kind of informal uncle to Daniel, appearing at the house with a frequency that suggested he regarded the Lawson kitchen as a secondary home, which was an assessment that both Jacob and Henrietta endorsed without saying so explicitly by simply always making enough food. Clarence Whitfield turned 11 in the spring of 1886 and came to the workshop one Saturday to ask Jacob formally if he could learn woodworking. Jacob looked at him for a moment and said, "Do you intend to take it seriously?" "Yes, sir," said Clarence, with the complete sincerity of 11-year-old Clarence Whitfield, who was incapable of insincerity about anything. "Then come Tuesday afternoon," Jacob said, "and wear clothes you don't mind ruining." Clarence came Tuesday afternoon and every Tuesday afternoon after that, and had an aptitude for the work that was satisfying to develop, his hand strong for his age, and his patience with the material instinctive in the way that Jacob had observed, was either something you had or something you worked very hard to acquire. The spring of 1886 brought changes to Caldwell that the town had known were coming, and that came anyway with the weight of the inevitable. The railroad extended further into the territory, and the pattern of the cattle drives shifted, and some of the drovers who had been coming through Caldwell for years began going elsewhere. The Silver Creek lost 2 of its regular card games. One of the smaller supply merchants on the main street closed up and moved his family south. It was the way of the frontier towns, this constant adjustment, the same process that had built them in the first place now reshaping them in the image of what came next. Caldwell was not going to disappear. It was too established for that, too rooted in the farming community around it and the services it provided. But it was going to change, and the change was visible in the faces of the men who had built their livelihoods on the trail traffic. Jacob talked to Tom Haverfield about it one evening in April, the 2 of them on the sheriff's porch with coffee, a friendship that had renewed itself naturally over the past 2 years. Tom was philosophical about it in the way of men who enforce order and therefore see all the things that order must accommodate. "The town will find its level," Tom said. "It always does. The people who came here because of the cattle money will go on to the next place, and the people who came here because they wanted to stay will stay." "Which kind are you?" Jacob asked. "I am the kind that has been here so long I have forgotten there is another kind," Tom said, which was as close to honest as Tom generally got on personal matters. Jacob thought about the fence and the gate and the carved animals and a woman who had stopped to look at a doe, and he said, "I know the feeling." The summer of 1887 brought a development that neither Jacob nor Henrietta had precisely planned, but that neither was surprised by either, which was the discovery that there was going to be a second child. Henrietta told him in the same kitchen in the same matter-of-fact way, and Jacob's response was the same as before, though it had the additional quality of recognition, the relief of a thing that was already known and welcome rather than new and unknown. He kissed her in the kitchen with Daniel on his hip, Daniel who was nearly 2 and had the firm, settled personality of a small person who has decided he likes his life, and Henrietta laughed against his cheek and said, "I told Mrs. Pemberton before I told you because I knew she would ask and I did not want to lie, and I want you to know she is already impossible about it." "How impossible?" "She has already chosen a name," Henrietta said. "She wants us to call the baby Dorcas if it is a girl after herself, which she presented as a suggestion but was clearly a campaign." Jacob looked at the ceiling for a moment, calculating his response. "What did you say?" "I said we would take it under advisement," Henrietta said, which satisfied her temporarily. They did not name the second child Dorcas. She was born in February of 1888, on a Thursday, and she was smaller than Daniel had been and extremely loud from the first moment, which Dr. Kavanaugh said was a perfect sign of health, and which Jacob entirely believed because the sound of her filled the whole house, and had the quality of a person announcing themselves to the world with conviction. They named her Clara Rose, after Jacob's mother, whose first name had been Rose, and whose memory he kept in the way that people keep the good memories of the dead, carefully, and without showing them too often. The middle name was his mother's. The first name was simply the name that suited her, which he had thought might be difficult given that it was also the name of his former wife, but which turned out not to be difficult at all because his daughter was so entirely herself from the first moment that the name belonged to her alone in his mind from the day he said it. Henrietta had looked at him when he suggested the name, carefully, with those green eyes that always saw the real thing, and he had said, "It is my mother's name. And she looks like she should be called Clara. I cannot explain that better than that." "You do not need to explain it better than that," Henrietta said. Clara Rose Lawson grew up to be different from her brother in almost every way. Where Daniel was quiet and observant, she was loud and immediate. Where Daniel was patient, she was relentless. Where Daniel saved his opinions for when they were truly necessary, she broadcast hers with an enthusiasm that showed absolutely no signs of diminishing. She was also, from a very early age, devoted to her brother with a single-mindedness that Daniel reciprocated in the dignified way that big brothers reciprocate things, which is to say, by tolerating her presence with visible grace and feeling her absence with invisible distress. The years between 1888 and 1892 were the years of building in both the literal and interior sense. Years in which the Lawson house expanded to accommodate the family it contained. Years in which Jacob's workshop grew into a proper furniture business that shipped pieces as far as Wichita and occasionally further. Years in which Henrietta taught a rotating cast of Caldwell's children and watched several of her earlier students grow into young people who came back to tell her what they had done with what she had given them. Mabel, the girl who had argued seniority over Clarence's bear, grew into the young woman Henrietta had predicted, sharp-minded and determined, and at 16 began reading law on her own, borrowing books from a lawyer named Harrison in Wichita that she corresponded with. This was not a path that led easily anywhere in 1892, because the law as a formal profession remained closed to women in ways that were not fair, and that Henrietta was entirely clear about. But she did not let her own reality diminish Mabel's ambition, and she told Mabel this directly. The world is unjust in specific ways, and you will encounter them, and you will decide how to navigate them, and the decision is yours. It was not comfortable advice. It was true advice, which was what Mabel needed, and Mabel went on to become the kind of woman who found the specific openings that the specific injustices had not managed to close. Clarence Whitfield took over his family's ranching operation at 18 when his father's health declined, and did it with the straightforward competence of someone who has been preparing for a thing for years without knowing it. He still came to the workshop sometimes in the evenings, not for lessons anymore, but because he liked the smell of the wood and the pace of the work, and because Elias Crane was his closest friend and Elias was there most days. Elias, at 24, had grown into a craftsman of real skill, and Jacob had made him a formal partner in the business on his 23rd birthday, a decision that surprised Elias visibly, and that Jacob regarded as simple reality since the business was by that point as much Elias' work as his own. The summer of 1892 was the summer that Margaret, Henrietta's sister from St. Louis, wrote to say that their brother Daniel had died. He had been well for years, Daniel Fletcher, and then a second illness had come in the spring, and this one had not been the kind that improved. He died in May, 63 years old, a man his sister had loved and worried about and corresponded with for the 9 years she had been in Kansas. Henrietta received the letter on a Thursday afternoon, and Jacob came in from the workshop to find her sitting at the kitchen table with the letter open in front of her, and Daniel, who was now 6, sitting beside her with his hand on her arm in the way of small children who do not know how to fix a thing, but refuse to be absent from it. Jacob sat down on her other side and put his arm around her, and she leaned into him, and Clara Rose, who was 4 and had read the room with the instinctive accuracy of her kind of person, came and climbed into her mother's lap, and the 4 of them sat in the kitchen in the afternoon light while Henrietta was quiet for a while, and Jacob held his wife the way a person holds someone when they cannot fix a thing and know it and stay anyway. "He was a good brother," Henrietta said finally. "Tell me about him," Jacob said. She did. She talked about Daniel Fletcher for the better part of an hour, the real Daniel Fletcher, not the ill one, the one who had taught her to fish in the river near Jefferson City, and who had a habit of buying things he didn't need, because he hated to disappoint a salesman, and who had cried at their mother's funeral, and then made a joke through his tears, because he could not sustain the crying longer than the feeling. Jacob listened to all of it, and the children listened in the way children listen to adult stories about adults they don't know, with a half-understanding that was still respectful, and when Henrietta was finished she was quieter but lighter, the way people are when they have given grief something to stand on. "We named our Daniel well," Jacob said. Henrietta looked at their son, who was looking at her with her own focused attention on his small face. "We did," she said. She wrote to Margaret that evening, and she wrote to the county record's office in Jefferson City to make sure her brother's affairs were properly noted, and she sat on the porch with Jacob in the last evening light, and he held her hand over the arm of the rocking chair, and she said, "I am glad I am here. I am glad I did not go back to Jefferson City when his wife first wrote." "You made the right choice," Jacob said. "You helped me make it," she said. "You made it," he said. "I was only on the porch." Henrietta turned her head and looked at him with the smile that had been the same since the beginning, the two-stage one that started on one side. "You were never only on the porch, Jacob," she said. "You were there. There is a difference." He thought about that for a while, sitting in the evening, listening to the familiar sounds of Caldwell settling into night, the distant piano at the Silver Creek, the creak of the church sign, the sound of cattle somewhere south, the ordinary beautiful sounds of a life that had found its shape. The years continued to move in the way that years move when life has become full, not quickly, but with the rich density of days that contain real things. Jacob's leg gave him more trouble in cold weather as he aged past 40, but he had long since made accommodations for this. The way he arranged his working days and took breaks that he had not taken in his 30s. The cane he had finally accepted without particular ceremony, when Dr. Kavanaugh suggested it on the grounds that the leg would last longer if he distributed the weight better. The cane was a thing he made himself, naturally. A good piece of seasoned walnut with a grip that fit his hand exactly, and a small carved running deer at the top that Clara Rose immediately claimed artistic credit for on the grounds that she had suggested deer when he asked her opinion. Henrietta taught until 1897, when the school board expanded the school and hired a second teacher, a young woman named Grace Alderton who came from Topeka and who was, Henrietta said after their first meeting, excellent and would need no particular help, but would benefit from having someone to talk to who had done the work for a while. Henrietta took on an informal consulting role with the school that suited her better than the full daily schedule had in the years when she was also raising 2 children, and she continued it for years with the satisfaction of someone who has found the right proportion of involvement. The children grew, as children do, in the direction of themselves. Young Daniel Lawson was 17 in 1902, and he had the combined qualities of his parents in a proportion that pleased them both. His mother's focused intelligence and his father's patience with material things, and he had become, in the years he had spent in the workshop beside his father and Elia's, a woodworker of considerable promise. He had also his mother's eyes and his father's height, and a quiet seriousness that occasionally softened into a dry humor that was his father's, and he was, both Jacob and Henrietta agreed in the private way that parents agree about their children, a person of real quality. Clara Rose was 14 in 1902, and she was not a woodworker in any direction. She was a talker and a reader and an arguer, and she had plans, multiple simultaneous plans, for what she was going to do with her life, and the plans changed regularly and were always advanced with equal conviction. Jacob had long since developed the skill of listening to each new plan with serious attention, while maintaining the interior understanding that the specific plan was less important than the quality of thinking behind it. And the quality of thinking behind Clara Rose's plans was, without exception, sharp and original. He told her once, when she was 12, and in a fury about something a boy at school had said about what girls could and couldn't do, "Your mother decided to come to Kansas when she knew nobody here and had just lost everything she had built. She sat on my porch and asked me to give her wooden animals for her classroom like it was the simplest thing in the world. There is not much you cannot do." Clara Rose had looked at him with an expression that was 14 and furious, and underneath the fury was soaking up every word, and she said, "Did she really just walk up to your porch?" "She stopped to look at a carved doe on the fence post," Jacob said. "She said the ear was particularly well done." "And that was how it started," Clara Rose said. "That was how it started," Jacob said. Clara Rose had looked at him for a moment with something that was not quite calculation and not quite wonder but was a combination of both, and then she said, "That is a very good story." "It is a true one," Jacob said. "The best stories generally are." In 1904, Daniel married a girl from the farmland south of Caldwell named Alice Mercer, a brown-haired, quiet woman with a deep laugh and a capacity for stillness that complemented Daniel's own nature in a way that was satisfying to watch. The wedding was in October, on a mild day, and Jacob stood beside his son in the church that he had been attending for 20 years now, and felt the movement of time in his chest, the particular gravity of watching something you made and raised and loved go forward into its own life. He held Henrietta's hand through the whole ceremony, her left hand in his left hand, and he could feel the ring she wore and the warmth of her palm, and the steadiness that had been there since the first time she held his hand on the September evening when it started. Clara Rose caught the bouquet, which she announced she had done deliberately because she wanted it as a decoration and not as a harbinger, which made everyone in the church hall laugh. By 1905, Jacob Lawson was 54 years old and Henrietta was 50, and the house at the north end of Caldwell was a different house from the one that had stood there in 1883, not because it was built differently, but because it was completely and entirely full of a life, the way houses get when people have actually lived in them for a long time. The bookshelves had multiplied. The porch had been rebuilt twice with better lumber, and was now a solid, generous structure with a good railing, and the carved animals along it had long since been replaced by new ones, and supplemented by pieces that the children had made, and that Elias had given as gifts, and that had been bought at various markets over the years. The porch still had 2 chairs, Jacob's chair and Henrietta's rocking chair with the horses on the arms. They sat in them every evening that the weather permitted, which in Kansas was a generous number of evenings, and they talked about the things that people who have been together for 22 years talk about, a mixture of the day's particulars and the larger questions that don't resolve but are worth returning to, and the small observations about the world that only have value because the other person is there to receive them. Jacob still carved, though his hands were slower and the detail work required better light than it once had. He had a lamp specifically for the carving, a good oil lamp that Henrietta had bought at the general store, and positioned with care on the porch railing in the spot where the light fell best on the work. He carved animals still mostly, though he had developed a habit of carving scenes now rather than single figures, small tableaus of the plains life, a horse and a rider, a hawk over a prairie, a family of deer at a water hole, scenes that told small stories in a few inches of wood. The doe from the fence post, the first one, the one Henrietta had touched on the day she stopped at his gate, sat on the mantelpiece in the sitting room. It had been there since she moved in, placed there by her, and he had never moved it and never would. On a Thursday evening in October of 1905, exactly 20 years from the month when young Daniel had been born, Jacob and Henrietta sat on the porch in the last of the autumn warmth with the stars coming out over the flat Kansas sky. Daniel and Alice were in their own house now, on the south side of Caldwell near the workshop, and they had news that had come that morning, which was that Alice was expecting their first child in the spring, which meant that Jacob and Henrietta were going to be grandparents, a status that they had both been approaching for some time, and that Henrietta had taken to with the equanimity she brought to most things, meaning she was deeply pleased and not making it a performance. Clara Rose had gone to Wichita the previous year to study at the academy there, an institution that admitted women to its teacher preparation program, and that she had decided to attend not because she intended to teach, but because the reading and the coursework and the people she would meet there were what she wanted, and teaching was the shape the opportunity came in. She had written a letter the previous week that was 4 pages long, and described her classmates with a precision that made Jacob and Henrietta both laugh at the kitchen table, and that contained, buried on the 4th page and introduced without preamble, a mention of a fellow named William Pratt who studied law in the same building and whose opinions on several subjects she found interesting. Jacob had read the letter twice and noted the 4th page and said nothing except, "She sounds well." Henrietta had said, "William Pratt," with the neutrality of a woman who has clocked something and is content to wait. Now, on the Thursday evening on the porch, with the stars and the cool air and the sounds of a Caldwell that was older and quieter than it had been in 1883 but still thoroughly itself, Jacob set down the carving he had been working on, a small scene of a horse and a fence post and a doe, and looked at his wife. She was reading, as she often was in the evenings, her head tilted slightly toward the lamp, and the light caught the gray in her auburn hair that had been accumulating for a decade now, and that he found beautiful in the way he found everything about her beautiful, specifically and accurately rather than in the general sense. She looked up and met his eyes, the way she had looked up at him on the very first day at the gate, direct and without hesitation. "What?" she said, in the mild tone of someone who has been looked at long enough to notice. "Nothing specific," he said. "I was thinking about the fence post." She knew exactly what he meant. She always knew exactly what he meant, which was one of the many things he had learned to rely on and not take for granted. She looked at the mantelpiece through the window where the doe sat in its usual place. "The ear was well done," she said. "You said that," he said. "It remained true," she said. He looked at the porch around them, the familiar boards, the railing with its current generation of wooden animals, the two chairs, the lamp, the door behind them that led into the house that was full of their life. He looked at the road beyond the fence, quiet in the evening, the dust of it settled, the last light fading from the horizon in the west. 3 years he had sat here alone and believed there was nothing left to come toward him. 22 years he had sat here with Henrietta Fletcher Lawson, and she had come toward him on a Tuesday morning in June 1883 and looked at a carved doe with the focused, honest attention of someone who saw things the right way, and she had walked up to his porch without looking at his scars first, and she had changed the direction of everything. "Henrietta," he said. "Jacob," she said, in the same tone she had always used, the one that said she was paying full attention. "I want to say that I am grateful," he said, "not in the way of something that needs saying because it has not been said. In the way of something that needs saying because it is true and the evening is good and the stars are out and it seems like the right moment." Henrietta looked at him for a long moment with those green eyes, and the two-stage smile came, one side first and then the other, the same smile it had always been. "I am grateful too," she said, "specifically and entirely." She reached across the arm of the rocking chair, and he met her hand with his, left hand to left hand, her ring and his warmth and the evening air of Kansas between them and around them. And the stars overhead were the same stars that had been over the plains since before there were towns or roads or fences. And the Silver Creek's piano, still going after all these years under a new owner who played slightly better than the old one, sent a slow melody up the north road. Daniel Lawson's son was born the following April, a healthy boy they named James Fletcher Lawson, after his grandfather on one side and the Fletcher name on the other, and Jacob held him in the kitchen on the morning of his birth with the same careful exact hold he had used 21 years before with young Daniel, and looked down at the small face, and felt the full circle of the thing, the man who had been done and finished and emptied out holding the proof that he had been none of those things. Henrietta stood beside him looking at the baby, and she said quietly, "James Fletcher Lawson, that is a very good name." "He has your eyes," Jacob said. "He has Daniel's nose," she said. "Poor child," Jacob laughed, and it was easy and full and entirely without rust. Clara Rose came home from Wichita for the birth, and she brought William Pratt, who turned out to be a decent young man of 24 with serious eyes and a genuine talent for listening, and who looked at Clara Rose with an attention that Jacob recognized, because it was the same attention he had once seen directed at a carved doe on a fence post. He watched William Pratt watch his daughter across the dinner table, and said nothing except to ask William's opinion on several subjects, not to test him, but because the conversation was interesting, and it was. After dinner, when William had stepped outside with Daniel to look at the workshop and Clara Rose was helping Henrietta with the dishes, Jacob sat in his chair on the porch in the April evening and listened to the voices inside the house. His daughter's emphatic particular voice, his wife's calm one, the lower murmur of the men at the workshop door, the new sound of an infant somewhere in the house. He picked up the small carving he had been working on, the horse and the fence post and the dough. He finished it that evening, putting in the final detail of the ear, the specific ear that had started everything. And when it was done, he held it in the lamplight and looked at it for a moment. Then he set it on the railing beside the chair where Henrietta would see it when she came out in the good spring evening to sit beside him. The door opened, and she came out with 2 cups of coffee, and she sat in the rocking chair and handed him one of the cups and looked at the new carving on the railing, the horse and the fence post, and the small doe with her head turned to one side. She looked at it the way she had looked at the first one, with focused, complete attention, and then she reached out and touched the ear with one finger, the same gesture, unchanged by 22 years. "The ear is very good," she said. "It always was," Jacob said. They sat in the spring evening with their coffee and the sounds of their family inside the house behind them and the plain stars coming out overhead, and the road beyond the fence was quiet, and the town of Caldwell, Kansas, was settling into its evening in the way it had been settling into evening since before either of them had come to it. And Jacob Lawson was exactly and entirely where he was supposed to be, on the porch, with Henrietta, in the life that a carved doe's ear had made possible.